Well, hello, and thanks to everyone who is listening. Thanks to everyone who participates in the Clever Chicas project. This idea that we celebrate women or who are ordinary women by many standards. But so these women who appear to be ordinary women actually are out doing extraordinary things with the aid of their male counterparts. And we call those people compañeros. Those are men who see women as equals and who stand beside them and join in this fight to make the world a better, and in our case, a more informed place. And so today we're very excited to have with us once again one of our premier and certainly our first compañeros, Dr. Alan Josephs, who has been a professor for a very long time. And he has written several books and several ideas on a vast array of topics. Many of you who have listened to his previous work understand his great familiarity with the nation of Spain, the culture of Spain, the connections of Hemingway to that nation and to that culture, and also to ideas of things Spanish, how Andalusian culture is really the oldest in Europe. And we heard about that a little bit in our first series of essays, but how those ideas of things that are ancient and things that are old continue to move forward in defining not only what is Spain, but in defining that residue as it comes forward in the New World, maybe all the way as far forward as the current American West. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. And while we're going to cover many topics with Alan Josephs, we want to talk in particular about this overarching idea that has been with us since before we had what will become modern day Spain. And that's the idea of the bully and how cultures talk about it and how writers deal with it and what we can learn from those ideas, so that if and when we're tempted to feel like a bully, heaven forbid, or worse and more likely we run into a bully, we have some larger ideas to think about and to pull from in our own brains, that when bullying comes up, be it socio-political or global on a large level, or if it's somebody sitting next to us in the grocery store, we have some ideas on the tradition of the idea, and how great thinkers before us have met and challenged it, and then how great writers and thinkers before us, including Dr. Alan Josephs, have worked to come together to pull forward ideas for Western civilization. And today, Alan, we're going to use your great talents in a variety of methods, most notably on your text, White Wall of Spain, The Mysteries of Andalusian Culture, and your paperback version of On Cormac McCarthy, Essays on Mexico, Crime, Hemingway, and God, the paperback version that has that foreword that about 30 years old from 1990, that has some ideas that I think can help us today. So with that whole mouthful out there, Alan, it's so hard to explain and describe who you are. First, welcome, Alan, and if you would tell us about yourself, beginning with your humble roots in the Tar Heel State.
Hi, Stone. Thanks for having me.
Thank
Hello,
you.
everybody. I was born in Charlotte a long time ago, of a rather unusual family for Charlotte. My father's side was 100% Lebanese. He was born in Charlotte, but his parents were both from Beirut. And my mother was from the Midwest, so I didn't really have any Southern blood in me. But I'm still a Southerner because I was raised in the South, born and raised in the South. And you are a native of where you are a native, and you have the culture where you were raised. So that makes me a Southerner, whether I have Southern blood or not.
I think that's an interesting idea to think about and to talk about when we're looking at some of our writers. Of course, we'll begin in Spain today, and then we'll end up on the landscape of the American West. And we see a lot of cultures where there are people living side by side with families who have been there for multiple generations, and then maybe people coming in who have moved in for whatever reason and trying to build a life together. I think that's certainly true of the things that writers like Ernest Hemingway in the in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and forward of the last century saw. And I think it's things that very true for things that writers and poets in Spain today are still seeing. As we get going, Alan, talking about the history of evolution and writing on this idea of who's native and who's born and all those kinds of ideas of cultures coming together in a region, I wonder if you could tell me from Hemingway's time, so when he goes over really to Europe for the first time in World War I, to now, as we watch Zelensky in Ukraine in conflict with Russia, I'm wondering if you could tell me from Spain and what's gone on in Spain over that last time period, are there any big shifts in ideology or shifts and change that you think are important for us to be aware of?
Yeah, there's some huge changes. Huge.
Okay.
In fact, there have been more changes since the Spanish Civil War in the late 30s until now than there were in the previous 5,000 years.
Oh my gosh. Now tell me what that means.
Well, my book, White Wall of Spain, the thesis of that book is that Andalusia is a land where there has been very, very little change. This was first brought to my attention, well, I suppose first brought to my attention intuitively, but in a scholarly fashion, it was brought to my attention by a wonderful book called The People of the Sierra, which was it was a study of 3 different censuses. I think it was 1752, 1852, and 1952 of a little town in the Sierra de Cádiz, the southernmost mountain range in Spain, just above sort of an extension of the Sierra Nevada. And it's just above Gibraltar and Cádiz and the Straits of Gibraltar, high mountains. And the little town is called Grazalema, although Pitt Rivers, Julian A. Pitt Rivers, who wrote the book, never called it Grazalema because he didn't want to get the people there in trouble. This was still during the Franco years.
Ooh.
And the censors read stuff that was written about Spain, and they came after you if you said something they didn't like. And it wasn't an active sort of retribution, but it could cause trouble. So he didn't want to cause trouble for any of those people. So he called it Alcalá de la Sierra, and that wasn't the real name of the town. The real name is Grazalema. I've been to Grazalema. It's a really interesting town. What was most interesting about his study of the censuses was that between 1752 and 1952, if those were in fact the years, I think they were, nothing had changed.
The numbers, you mean, or the population, or?
The population was the same. The jobs were the same. The town was the same. It hadn't expanded or grown. It was the same. And so he came up with the idea that Grazalema was really much more like a primitive Greek polis or Greek city-state than it was like a Roman urbs or city.
Okay.
It's, in other words, not urban and unchanged. Now, Brodel wrote a great study of life in the Mediterranean in the time of Philip II, which was around 1588. And what his thesis is that everything in the Mediterranean depends on the limited supply of everything. They all use the same products. It doesn't matter whether you're in Lebanon or in southern Spain or in Algeria. You still have olives and olive oil. You still have lemons and oranges. You still have nuts. You still have fish. You still have vegetables. All the same. So that the whole Mediterranean had a kind of uniformity to it, particularly in antiquity, that it perhaps lacks today because of political and religious differences. But if you put those two together, the fact that in Andalusia, you're always, or in the Mediterranean world, you're always dealing with limited resources. And then you put that together with Pitt Rivers' notion that what we really have is a town more like 1000 BC than any other time, then you begin to get an idea of what I mean by virtually no change in 5,000 years. When I first went to Spain in the 60s, early 60s, it was like, if you went out in the countryside, it was like going for a walk in the Old Testament.
So when you went, because this is kind of an interesting juxtaposition for me, particularly for our Clever Chicas listeners at the Boys and Girls Club in Northwest Georgia. You're leaving as this young person from the South. So you're leaving from Charlotte, North Carolina, or Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
I was 19.
Okay, yeah. So you're a young guy. You've been raised in the American South in the 1960s. Where so it was still,
50,
pretty unchanged
50.
In the 1950s.
Yeah. I went to Spain in 62.
Okay, so you're looking at a place that is really, you grew up in an American South that had really not, it sounds like a lot like this part of Spain had really not had the modern world come in so much. In other words, you were maybe not as worldly as someone from New York City or Chicago or Los Angeles, because you had grown up in the American South that was still kind of tied to the old ways. And so to hear someone like who grew up in that environment say, I went to Spain and it was more like being in 1000 BC. I mean, it was more like walking through, how did you feel? Did you feel at home? Did you feel welcome? Did you feel foreign? How did that kind of being caught in a time warp make you feel?
Well, all three. I always felt foreign. I still feel foreign when I'm in Spain, simply because if you're not Spanish, you're not Spanish. Although they don't hold it against you. I did feel welcome because the Spaniards make everybody who wants to be welcomed welcome. And I felt at home. And that was the strangest part of all, because all of a sudden, and I mean all of a sudden, I felt like I was home in a place I'd never been. And that was a very odd feeling. And I felt more at home in Spain than I had ever felt where I was raised.
Wow. And do you attribute that to maybe it was some kind of connection to that ancient world that had just stayed the same for so long that it resonated with you? I mean, how can that be?
I think it's in Green Hills of Africa, where Hemingway talks about racial memory. And he doesn't mean by racial there, he doesn't mean anything to do with racism or anything like that. By racial memory, he means, I think, the idea that we somehow preserve some sort of sense of memory from our upbringings through the ages. Now, I poo-pooed that when I was 20 years old. I completely poo-pooed it. I said, that can't be true. But it just didn't make sense. But I'll tell you this, the farther south I went in Spain, the more at home I felt. Now, it doesn't have anything to do with the American South. It has to do with the Mediterranean, because it's the Mediterranean that really makes me feel good. That's the place that I feel most at home, is in the Mediterranean. And of course, my dad's side of the family, being Lebanese, was Phoenician. And the Phoenicians were the first settlers in southern Spain that came from off the peninsula around 1000 BC. And they built little towns and settlements in Cadiz and in Malaga and all around, up into Cordoba, up into Spain. And they had a tremendous influence on southern Spain.
And so let me make sure I'm getting this, because you have your father came at some point, his family lived in that part of the world. You have a direct connection to that Phoenician history. Right. And so this idea that you grew up in Charlotte, which was a very American southern city, with a Midwestern mother and a Phoenician father, that somewhere in that amalgamation of connections to the past, this Phoenician connection that came through via your father was really was really noticeable and alive for you when you went to Spain for the first time. Did I get that right?
Yeah, yeah. The thing is, I rejected it at first because it wasn't logical. I didn't realize at the time that logic was part of the problem of our society. That yeah, well, it is, because we put ever since Descartes, we do everything according to logic. But as Einstein says, logic will get you from A to B, but imagination can take you anywhere.
And I think that's what we're getting at today. Yes, 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 yes. Because our kids at the Somerville Boys and Girls Club, Grady in particular, asked for a podcast because I think that we see this quest and this hunger for imagination. Because remember, your audience will be listening to you, right? And so they're imagining what we look like and where we're sitting. And so where Descartes might have said it would be better for us to write it out and write in all the details, or to show us in person so they could see everything. Perhaps ironically to some of our listeners, Einstein, kind of the first guy you learned about in science, is really applauding this imagination that you're saying it took time for you to value and appreciate. Did I get that right?
Yeah, yeah. Einstein and all the rest of the new physicists are really mystics.
Ooh, tell us about that.
And well, Einstein makes it pretty clear. He says it's impossible not to believe in God.
Okay, and tell us about the context of that time in the year when he's saying that.
I don't know when he said it,
but the era when Einstein is living and what's going on there.
It's after he came to the States.
Okay,
because that's when he got questioned so much.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I'm getting at. So he's doing great, and he comes to America, and everybody's like, "What are you talking about?" And he really develops it, doesn't he?
Well, I think he was probably the first, or one of the first, to realize that we'd put all of our eggs into the basket of reason and nothing into the basket of intuition or sensuous feeling. And I think that's a mistake. And I think he thought it was a mistake. And certainly Picasso thinks it's a mistake. And Hemingway does, although they don't say so in as many words, but they rebel against the world order of the time. When Hemingway and Picasso were growing up, there was only one way to think. It's not like today at all. There was only one way. And that, in Hemingway's case, of course, was the Oak Park Protestant way. Oak Park, where they had a big sign in 1900 that said, "Welcome to Oak Park, where the churches begin and the bars end."
Right. What a great quote. So this idea that there's one way to do it. And we're really talking about, for those who are maybe younger and haven't gotten there in their schooling, we're really talking about the turn of the last century. So late 1800s, early 1900s, all the way up to World War I, y'all. This is recent history where Dr. Josephs is explaining to us that there was one way to think. You follow a particular religious ideology and you do the correct things, or not only is the preacher going to get mad at you, the town and the police are. That's kind of what you're getting at, right?
Yeah, and I think what's done that more than anything, what's changed our minds more than anything, it's a combination of two things. It's modern art and new physics.
Modern art. And so can you name a person in case we wanted to look it up? Who would you say? Would you say Picasso's the best guy to go with?
Absolutely.
And he's Spanish, of course, right?
Yeah, you got to start with Cezanne, but Picasso is the main man.
So, and for the physicists, would we stick with Einstein, the new physicist? Is that who you'd stick with?
It's not just Einstein. It's Einstein and virtually all of the new physicists who come after him.
Okay, but so he's like a good anchor for people maybe want to learn more about that to look forward.
I would suggest a book by Gary Zukav, Z-U-K-A-V, called The Dancing Wu Li Masters. It has to do with a Japanese dance troupe that is a kind of mystical Japanese dance group. And he equates that dance group with the new physics and the way it works. It sounds pretty far-fetched, but it really is a very good explanation of what the new physicists are trying to get at. And essentially what they're really trying to get at, of course, is the origin of life. We're trying to get to the God particle.
Okay. Okay. So you're telling me that until about 120 years ago, everybody followed one or two particular faiths. For example, maybe they were Catholic or they were Protestant in the United States, for
Right.
example.
Yeah.
Um, and the laws and the way that people were educated and that they learned in school were kind of built around those ideas. And a lot of this enlightenment, I mean, we're grateful for it. It comes maybe out of early American, when we look at Benjamin Franklin and Paine and all those guys, really in that age of enlightenment that become that, during the time when we get America, we get the French Revolution. I can kind of see how those ideas were so important. But of course, following that, we get the ideas of romanticism, where people are like, okay, maybe we've got a little too much logic and a little too much reason. And
Yeah.
so we're going to do some romanticism. We're going to worry about things being sacred and secular and dividing those ideas up. But really, it's very hard to get those ideas of reason out of a culture
It is.
once they've gotten in.
It is. It is. And the biggest problem, perhaps, I mean, this whole thing is laden with problems. It's like trying to walk through a minefield. Uh, the biggest problem probably is the fact that everything is generalizations. And we all know that generalizations don't work well. They're problematic always. And so it's very easy to argue with generalizations. But what some of these generalizations are trying to get at is that maybe we haven't done everything exactly the way we should. And as brilliant as the Enlightenment was, and as important as it was, there wouldn't be any America if it weren't for the Enlightenment. Nevertheless, we put again all of our eggs into that basket, and while that's good, logic is good. Logic will get you from A to B, but logic won't take you into outer space, into deep space.
Right, right, right. And logic will allow you to grow beautiful tomatoes and beautiful spinach and beautiful vegetables, but you need that idea of invention to create a memorable meal, right?
Got to have a little Mother Nature too.
Yeah, got to have a little Mother Nature. Well, since you bring up Mother Nature, let's talk about how that impacts and affects some of these ideas. We've been talking a little bit about maybe scientists are kind of mystic, and we've been talking about it kind of as an anchor to get started on our key topic of, we were looking at kind of the history of ideas, but Mother Nature really matters more in some cultures than others. You and I are both North Carolinians and both Southerners, and I grew up in the mountains, you grew up in the Piedmont, and so we have very different natures that we grew up with. But even in my religious and my organized religion traditions, in my more mystic traditions that came from my family's connection to Native American cultures, nature always drives the day in all of my stories. Would you say that's true for this ancient Spanish culture? What's the role of nature for them?
Well, I think everything, because I think that what Andalusians have preserved, Spaniards in general, but particularly in Andalusia and up into Extremadura and some of the other areas, what they've preserved is a kind of form of animism.
Tell us what that means.
Animism is the belief that there's spirit in everything. You
Okay.
think about Native Americans, the Great Spirit, right? For the Native Americans, everything has spirit. Well, the Andalusians are kind of that way too. And if you talk to Andalusians, intelligent ones who've studied a lot about this subject, they'll get a little glint in their eye and they'll start agreeing with you and say, oh yeah, we're pantheists. That's exactly what we are. We believe that there is God in everything. And some of the Marian cults in southern Spain, there are two or three in particular, like the Virgen del Rocío, are almost exact recapitulations of the mother goddess worship of antiquity.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So this idea of animism and there's a spirit in everything kind of inches along then through time with this idea of one God or a Christianity or a Judaism. They kind of inch along and kind of work together. And I'm bringing that up because of this really American idea. We've been talking about Spain and the United States a lot, but thanks to your expertise. But the Americans in this age of enlightenment, the big religion that really drove a lot of our founding fathers and got some of them in trouble was this idea of deism, right? That really enlightened form of religion that I can prove through an enlightened, scientific, reasoned way, really kind of sometimes more Aristotelian than Platonic, that there is a God by using hardcore logic to evidence that because this happens in nature, one can evidence that God is the explanation. And it seems kind of interesting to me. Yes.
What's usually not known or taught is that so many of the great thinkers like Newton were actually, they were mystics and they belonged to secret societies. The problem is that the church had so much power, whether it was the British church or the Roman church, doesn't make it much difference. The Roman church was probably even more persecutory, but Descartes was a mystic too. Descartes got most of his ideas while he was sleepwalking out on the pier in Marseille. And I mean, he's not logical at all. Neither is Newton. They all believed in secret societies. The occult means the hidden, and what was hidden was what the church hid, because the church didn't want you to know about it. And what those things were, especially, was the wisdom of antiquity, which was burned at the Library of Alexandria.
Yes. So this idea that deism, which becomes very public and is a very direct counter to a lot of the teachings of the Roman Catholic, the Irish Catholic, or the British Anglican, what will be the American Episcopal Church. In the meantime, it's a very declarative, enlightened form of religion that people were very open with, and you could kind of get away with it in America, right? That was one of the perks of coming to America. You could even use science to believe in God, and nobody was going to maybe run you out of town the way that so many people had been.
Christian Science.
But how? Right. Christian Science is today may be a great example of that. But how interesting, Dr. Josephs, that we're going along with this idea of, okay, during Enlightenment and in this new world, it's okay to come out and use science to evidence God, and yet the scientists themselves were hiding any connection to mysticism. Did I get that right?
Well, because the church persecuted mysticism that was extra ecclesiastical.
So outside their teachings, is that what that means? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Right.
And yet they kept going, and it seems that we keep talking a lot about things that you feel and that you can't really understand.
When St. John of the Cross used the imagery from the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon in his poetry, the Inquisition came after him.
So the Inquisition, is that a great big fancy word for bully during a particular time in history?
Well, they were bullies, yeah. It was the church police.
And what time period were they out and about murdering?
Well, they started during the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella, or Fernando e Isabel. One of Isabel's confessors, Torquemada, was one of the chief inquisitors, and it was used ever after. In 1492, the Catholic kings, as they're called, Ferdinand and Isabel, were convinced by Torquemada and others to get rid of the Jewish population of Spain, which was the most important Jewish population in Europe. They were called the Sephardim, as opposed to the Ashkenazim. They're the Iberian, Spanish and Portuguese Jewish population. They're the oldest and most important Jewish population at that time in Europe. And they ran Spain. And the higher up your blood, the more nobility and royalty you had in your bloodline, the more likely you were to have Jewish blood, because the top people in Spanish society prior to this time married into Jewish families. because they were smart, because they were running everything, because they were the economists, they were the financiers. As is so often the case, they were extraordinary people. Well, Torquemada convinced them to run the Jews out of Spain. They either had to convert to Catholicism publicly, or they had to leave. And so in 1492, on, I think it was August the 2nd, on the same tide that Columbus sailed on his first trip,
Wow.
the first ships full of Spanish Jews sailed out of the Spanish harbor headed for Morocco and Portugal.
Wow. So, we learn, for one thing, and by we, when I say me, full disclosure, I grew up in an Episcopal church, which is the American version of the Church of England, which was formed, in the vernacular, so that one King Henry VIII in particular could get a divorce. I mean, that's the cocktail party reason of
Right.
why people say there's a Church of England and that England was no longer Catholic, right? But
Yeah.
but for those who grow up in the faith, we know that there's
They were Catholic. They were Catholic. They weren't Roman Catholic.
Right. They were. And so for those who grew up in the faith, when people say that to us, we say, well, there's really a lot more to it than that. And so I think over time, Dr. Josephs, it's important to say that, I just watched, for example, there's a show called Reign, REIGN, that has like 4 seasons, and it's really kind of an interesting show that talks about Mary Queen of Scots and Queen Elizabeth and the leaders in France, and the whole time they're worried about the Catholic Church and the fight between Catholics and Protestants, because
Right.
let's be honest, that's still a problem today in many parts the world. But I'm struck by the fact that you say on the same day that Spain goes to the New World,
On the same day, on the same tide, from the same port.
Right. That in fact, it's not the Protestant issue that's such a problem. It is a problem that the world watched in horror over the last century, and that we're still trying to reconcile today. And that is the idea of bullying the Jewish population, a culture that is equally old, right? I mean, we know how old the tribes are. And so while we're on this topic, just a sort of an aside that may lead us back into our ultimate goal, why do you think it is that we don't talk, that when we talk about the Inquisition and we talk about the problems with England and the rest of Europe and the Catholic Church, why do you think the focus in our education system has become on the battle between Protestantism and Catholicism, with little mention of how the Jewish culture is impacted?
Well, I don't, that's all very speculative, but I will say this. If Spain hadn't decided to base their nationalism, when Ferdinand, who was king of Castilla, who was the king of Aragon, and Isabel, who was the queen of Castilla, got married, their idea was to unify all of what is today Spain. And they did that, but they used religious unity and the church to cement that. And that was a mistake, because in doing so, they got rid of the Muslims and they got rid of the Jews. And in doing that, they weakened Spain greatly. There's an amusing anecdote about that. Spain, as you probably know, has the greatest ham in the world. Their pigs are absolutely famous, and the ham is just unbeatable. And sorry, Italians, but it's not prosciutto, it's jamon
or
serrano.
Virginians, right? Spain's got it.
Why does Spain have the greatest ham in the world? Because everybody in Spain ate ham every day to prove that they were neither Muslim nor Jewish.
No, really?
Yeah. So they had to have good ham, and they did. They do. It's one good thing to come out of the Inquisition. It's indirect, but it's there.
And I think that you're getting to a great point. So many things are indirect, because you bring up another population that's often not discussed. The idea that, of course, if you're not Catholic, Muslims are not Catholic. I mean, by very definition. So we're looking at on the same day, on the same tide, from the same port, that we're going to the New World, to begin what will become, a colonization and a spreading of the word. We see that Muslims and Jews, who have been so foundational to the history of this very ancient culture, have been evacuated, I guess would be a fair word. And what I'm hearing you say out of this, Alan, is that you never know when it's going to be your day to be bullied, right? In the past, Spain, sounds, from what you've shared with us, relied pretty heavily on Jewish citizens living there, relied pretty heavily on Muslims living there. And
right.
and then when we want to unite two different regions, Aragon and Castilla, we say, well, anybody who's not like us has to get out.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
And can we ever think of a time in history when that worked out, when we said, well, if you don't look like me, you got to go? Because I was racking my brain. I can't think of one time where that's ended well.
No, it certainly didn't end well in the 20th century.
Certainly it did not. And what we see beginning in 1492 is kind of interesting. It's such a part of our culture. Even that little series Reign that I was talking to you about, which is really kind of a mashup, as the kids might call it. It tells the loosely based facts, Alan, of the lives and times of those monarchs, or Dr. Joseph's. I'm sorry, he's Alan to me. I can't help myself. But it tells the loosely based lives of those monarchs, but it also uses millennial songs. And so maybe the monarchs are going to be getting together at a party, and they will say to each other the lyrics from a popular modern day song, and then the song will play. So you see, we see so many examples in our culture where we take the ideas of the past and then kind of meld them into our future ideologies. And so, sometimes, Alan, that's a great idea, because I've gotten some students to say, wow, this is really interesting. And I'm like, well, hey, if you really like that, maybe you should reach the history books. And it gives people a way to say, ooh, let me read this and then learn what really happened. And it's a super idea. But what I learn, whether I have students watching Reign or reading Hemingway or working with me at a graduate level on your textbooks, is that every classroom I go into, Alan, people are struck by the history of the bully. And I think with what we've seen go on in Ukraine, maybe that topic is popular. That of course those issues with Crimea have been going on for 10 years, and of course thousands of years as well, right? But in modern history, for 10 years people were kind of like, oh, that's probably not great. And then, with Zelensky and the images, not unlike the American Civil War, when people actually see it, the notion of bully and the topic of bullying comes together. But I would like to, with everything you've shared with us, consider bullying in maybe some different ways. So we have nations bullying, the way that...
Well, let's start at the beginning.
Yeah, okay.
Take 2001, the film, which I find basically pretty boring, Hal and all that business. I don't like it. And the computer is eventually going to be the worst bully of all. But there's that fabulous first scene where the guy discovers a club and then starts clubbing his pals and his chums and his enemies and the other guy, and the aggression just takes over, just naked aggression. And that sets the tone for the rest of humanity from there on.
Yes. And so that film came out in late 60s, early 70s?
Somewhere in there. Yeah, I'm not sure of the date.
But I mean, but generations ago, as we said, in 2022, this idea of how, and can you remember that? And so tell us a little bit. The premise of the film is that technology that we have invented is maybe not going to end well. Is that a fair summary of the film?
I think that's one way you can look at it. Yes, for sure.
For sure. But at the time, I mean, didn't it seem kind of wacky and kind of far-fetched to maybe many in the audience?
Well, obviously not to the people who made the film.
Was it in fact a cautionary tale, the way that maybe a Cervantes,
and it's prophetic,
who's writing Don Quixote?
It's prophetic. It's prophetic. It's pathetic and it's prophetic.
Is it prophetic in the same way that a writer like Cervantes, who gives us the idea, the hero figure, the anti-hero, the myth, all the literary terms of a Don Quixote? If that idea is beware the machines, maybe Quixote's idea is beware the conformity. But I'm wondering if it's not coming all from that same basic concern that we have, that what if the bully's the first one to find the club?
Well, usually the bully is the first one to find the club, or I guess the other way to look at that is the club converts the discoverer into a bully because it gives him power. You know the old saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, yeah. Yeah.
And
That,
so when we were kids, I don't know if you were ever bullied. I was bullied for a lot of reasons. I wore glasses. I was kind of bookish. I had buck teeth. I had brown hair. I don't know. But kids find anything to bully, right?
yeah.
But then as I got older and as I knew my peer group, and it kind of gets back to that idea that we were talking about very, very early on, that I had that racial memory that you were talking about. My family has been, in an Anglo-Saxon community for thousands of years, or certainly hundreds and hundreds of years. My family was involved in the settling of the region of Western North Carolina I lived in. And so over time, kids will build communities, if for no other reason than to get mad at their parents in mass, right?
Yeah.
Um, but again, if I wanted to bully somebody, I kind of had to go up to their face and do it, or I could leave a little note, maybe, right? Kind of the ways that we've seen over time. Because I had to have some accountability. I had to be actively complicit. And Hal, and the film that we talk about from 30 years ago, kind of opens the door for those questions of what happens when you don't have to be complicit, when you can just fire it off in the privacy of wherever you are, and maybe identify yourself, maybe not. But this notion of the idea of the computer, I do think has taken bullying in a different way. And so as we get to this idea of bullying, I kind of like to go back to this notion of the Inquisition, where we're talking about, we have America because Ferdinand and Isabella, and in England, Elizabeth, will fund these great expositions to what would be the New World, right? And so many great things happened out of it. But as we all know, when these folks showed up, guys, because they were guys, showed up in the New World, some of them found a club when they got off the boat, didn't they?
Some of them took a club on the boat.
Right. And so, the way that these ideas of, was the New World formed by bullies? That seems a little reductionist, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, to me, the idea is it's not about bullying. It's about human nature.
Okay. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, bullying is just part of human nature. Power struggles. That's what we do, is power struggles. Because the people that didn't do power struggles didn't survive. They either got eaten by the saber-toothed tiger or they got wiped out by the gang down on the corner.
So that, in other words, if you feel an urge or an impulse to bully another, it doesn't mean that there's something innately wrong with you. It means that you're human.
I don't know that I would word it exactly that way, because I'm not trying to excuse bullying in any way. However, it is part of human nature. And the whole idea of the survival of the fittest tells us where the bullies come from.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Because, everybody's bullied somebody at some point or another.
Yeah.
I know that, if I'm in a hurry to go to the grocery store and I see some nice young man standing there with 5 items, and I've got a whole cart and I want to get out of there in a hurry, I know that even with my whole cart, if I smile at him, he's going to let me cut. And the truth of it is, because he's got a mother somewhere, right, who brought brought him food home every day. And so this little child's probably going to let me get out, even though I have more stuff than he does. And so one could argue that I'm using what I know over him. I'm exercising power over him and kind of bullying him out of the way in the line. So, I think it's really important, or in my work, particularly with younger people, I like what you're getting at, this idea of human nature, that we're certainly all capable of it. And there may be times when we feel like in an us or them situation, what motivates us. What's concerning, I think, as we all sit and watch the events unfold in Ukraine, is that there's always more to the story. And so for today's conversation, for example, this idea that the fights in Europe when we were coming to the New World weren't just over Catholic and Protestant, that so many of us have heard growing up, Alan, by well-intended teachers, because our Protestant ancestors came over from Europe, and so that's what we learned in school, right? But you've added that extra layer of two other ethnicities, the Jewish culture and the Muslim culture, who were asked to leave as well for larger reasons. Bullying nonetheless, but extra pieces to the story that can give us a larger focus on where we're going today. So if we acknowledge the idea that everybody has it in them to be a bully, here's the question. Do you think that we can learn more from studying the past through that lens of a bully, or is that counterproductive and just teaching us more ways to be a bully? In other words, how do we, is it helpful to look at past bullies? Should we look at this king and queen of Spain and say, well, let's see who they bullied? Or do we look at them, and when we find things that may seem kind of like bullying, address it as such?
There are all kinds of bullying. Let's go back to the discovery of the New World.
Okay.
The Brits came over here basically for commercial reasons, not for religious reasons. The Spanish went to the New World basically for religious reasons. Does that mean the Spaniards didn't bully the natives? No, it doesn't. However, they survived.
Tell me more about that. You say that
we don't have any Native Americans left.
Right.
Because the English system killed them all. Wiped them out, got rid of them. The Spanish system converted them, married them, and had children with them.
So either way, the purity is gone, either because they died from the smallpox that the British brought in, or they became Spanish when they married into Spanish bloodlines and had children.
The British didn't bring smallpox, the Spanish did.
The Spanish did. Thank you for that. See, we're learning, people. So the Spanish brought smallpox in, and they would have brought that into the southern parts of the New World, right?
They killed millions and millions and millions of Mexican natives with smallpox. Inadvertently, they didn't want to kill them. They wanted them. The Spaniards viewed the people as richness, as wealth, not as slaves, but as servants of God, the same God that they believed in. And they wanted to keep them. They didn't want to get rid of them. The English seem to have seen the natives as an impediment. Now, it is true that some of our Native Americans were particularly fierce, but still, it was a question of survival. One of my favorite books of recent years is Empire of the Summer Moon. I can't think of his name. It's about the last chief of the Comanche. And I can't remember. That's irritating that I can't remember his name.
We'll put it in the notes.
Quanah Parker and the Rise and Fall of the Comanche Nation. Fantastic book. Extraordinary.
And the Rise and Fall of the Comanche Nation. We'll put all the books everybody mentioned in the notes so that you can easily find them.
It may be the most exciting history book I've ever read.
Really? And it's fairly new, you say?
Yeah, it came out this century.
Oh, cool. Okay. And just so everybody knows, any of the books and the notes, any of the books or the key topics he mentions will be in the notes as well. So if you're curious or interested in reading about some of the books or the scholars he talks about, you'll be sure to check out the notes notes where we'll share that information. So this idea of what happened when people came from the old world, right, and or came from Europe, and that's a kind of an interesting point, that were the native people some specifically fierce. Well, as somebody who has links to the Cherokee Nation, I have to be honest, Alan, I'm proud to hear that. I'm proud to hear that there were brave warriors, and that kind of, I think, gets into the lore maybe that I grew up with, as somebody who saw what was left of the Cherokee Nation. I grew up not very far from what is left of Cherokee, North Carolina, which is now, of course, has casinos and other attractions. Learned
So,
about the, yes.
I can go you one better there. I'm going to one up you.
Do it.
I was in Unto These Hills when I was 19 years old. I played the drunken soldier who kills the hero.
Well, we know that you had to act, because I can't imagine you drunk, Alan. What a crazy idea. We know that was just play acting. So right. So Unto These Hills, for everybody who doesn't know, and I'll certainly put the link into it, is another example of kind of what we're getting at, of how do stories get told. And so in Western North Carolina, every year it's an outdoor play in an absolutely beautiful setting that tells the story of how the English come and meet the natives.
Betrayal. No, it's the Americans, not the British.
Tell me.
With the Cherokee, well, it was Andrew Jackson.
Okay, hang on.
Jackson's the one who put him on the Trail of Tears.
Okay, and tell me, so if I look up, I will not find your name in the program, but I will find this idea, because your part was you were a drunken soldier who killed
Sali, Tsali. Sali is the Native American hero.
And while the story is grounded in fact.
Oh yeah, it's very historical.
But it's also very entertaining, and it does a really lovely job, I would argue, of setting it in the setting where these events could have happened. So in other words,
it's right there in Cherokee.
Yes, you get a lot of authenticity, because you can imagine what the trees looked like, and you can imagine what it smelled like and what it felt like. And so that can be good, and it can also be dangerous, right? Because if we, like, for example, I want to pile in on a particular person later when we look back at history, then it can be good, it can be bad. It's really hard to know what it felt like and looked like to be there on the Trail of Tears, these many years later, when we've had so many different shifts in the way we look at the world. And I think a great example, Dr. Josephs, is how you've told us that we went from Enlightenment to Romanticism, and then of course we'll come forward to realism, and then we'll hit those big ideas of modernism that you were talking about, where people like Picasso and Hemingway and Einstein really ushered forward a new way of thinking. And so for me, Dr. Josephs, it's always hard to say, now that so many people have touched that story, how do we really understand what it felt like and what it meant to be Sali, and what it meant to be the first drunken soldier who killed him, which kind of gets at why we have you here and talking about dealing with bullies and the way some of your areas of expertise have done that. And so specifically, I'd like to talk about your connection to the old world, to Spain, with the development of the Don Quixote figure. Mm-hmm. And then I would like to kind of bridge into the new world and talk a little bit about Tarzan. And then I would like to finally wrap it up with the time we have left with talking about cowboys and cowgirls and what that means to this idea of a world where, as a 19-year-old, you play in Unto These Hills, and as a grown man with children of your own, you work to capture history and religion for the generations after you. Does that make sense? So let's talk a little bit about we've talked about how the layering of time makes it difficult. I mean, I'm from North Carolina myself, and you had to correct me twice, and I've seen it more times than I care to remember because I'm just in casual conversation. Imagine how all that has shifted and changed over an idea like Don Quixote, for example, the idea of the quixotic hero. If we could, I'd like to talk about, in relation to bullies, the evolution of the quixotic idea of Don Quixote in Spain, and then a little bit on Tarzan and cowboys in the American ideology of confronting bullies. Do we have time to do that?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're the boss.
And everybody heard that. I'm going to remind you that you said that because I can find this time code. Well, in the words of the great Mickey Gilley, 1, 2, 3, go.
You want me to talk about Don Quixote?
I want to, because the idea in Cervantes, recently you and I talked a lot. I was very fortunate to see the American Ballet Theater in there, and this is kind of context. So the American Ballet Theater, located out of New York, has long been kind of the home of America's ballet standard. And we're very fortunate in this country to have so many companies that help them do that. But at the 50th anniversary of the John F. Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., which is a center that hosts the great representations of American art for 50 years now, the American Ballet Theater has come for 50 years every year, and at great expense and sacrifice, and brought different productions. And in this 50th year, Dr. Joseph, I thought it was really significant that they brought Don Quixote. And so Don Quixote is a novel that starts with Cervantes, and it's told in many ways. You can see it in cartoons. You can certainly see the influence in fashion. You can see it in art, obviously, as you're quite the expert on that. But the ballet, for example, if you go to see the opera, it's translated into plays, into operas, The Man of La Mancha, the film, right? That's so well known. But if you look at the ballet, for example, the Don Quixote figures are characters, but the real dance and the real focus of the ballet is actually on different figureheads of Spain, the matador, the idea of the rogue who goes out and takes over and wins the day, even though he wasn't highborn. So there's just so many ideas in Cervantes and the idea of Don Quixote that really what the ballet focuses on is not Don Quixote himself at all. And yet you and I have talked about this. No matter where that story's told, if it's Man of La Mancha, if it's a ballet, if it's a novel, if it's a cartoon, because there are so many, the idea always seems to come through that the person who has the determination to live their own life and challenge the norm wins. So the person who gets away from the bully of the state or the bully of the neighbor, of the bully of the family tradition, is the one who's really living life. And no matter how it's retold or who the focus, that's what we see. And there has to be something more than reason, right? There has to be something mystic, something deeper in that I will argue, with your help, hopefully, we see continue in American stories of bullying, like Tarzan and the cowboy. So I know I said a lot, but let's start with Don Quixote. Why does that story work and tell the same message no matter who's telling it?
Well, the thing that we need to remember about Don Quixote, two things. One, it's the beginning of the modern novel. All European and American and later world novels come from Don Quixote. It's the first one. Yes, there are precedents like the Lazarillo de Tormes and so on. There are plenty of precedents in the Near East and even in the Far East. But in terms of European and North American culture, Don Quixote is the beginning of the modern novel, not of the novel, but of the modern novel.
And so what years are we talking about, and what makes it modern?
1605 was the first part, and 1615 was the second part, 10 years later.
When you say modern, like what, because that's a very active time in the literary world. When you say it's not the first novel, but the first modern novel, what does that mean?
Well, it means that there are precedents in the Middle East and in China and in India.
Okay. Okay, so this is the first from that part of the world that tells the story in the way that a novel
But
does.
it's also modern because of the way it's written.
Tell me about that.
Well, the long narrative. It's not a collection of stories like, say, the Arabian Nights, the 1001 Nights, where Scheherazade has to tell a different story every night or have her head cut off. It's completely different because it's all of a piece. Well, mostly all of a piece. There are some extraneous parts, but that's neither here nor there for what we're talking about.
Mhm.
The main fact to bear in mind about Don Quixote is that it was written under extreme censorship, the extreme censorship of the Inquisition. You could almost say that it was a product of the Inquisition. Don Quixote, o sea, rather Cervantes, was under huge pressure to write in such a way that the Inquisition couldn't come after him. So he wrote satire. Don Quixote is a satire. And it starts off as a satire of a genre that existed prior to Don Quixote, which was very popular, which were called the novelas de caballerías, which loosely translated means the novels of knighthood.
Right.
And they were about heroes. Amadis de Gaula, for example, would go into battle against the whole army all by himself. Makes the superheroes of today look like weenies. Now, these books were extremely popular. They were so popular that the Spaniards who were coming to the New World had a lot of these novels read to them by the priest. There was always a priest on board, except in one instance, Columbus's first ship. And the priest could read. So the priest would sit around when they had spare time and read these novels of chivalry, as we call them in English, and knighthood or chivalry. Chivalry is probably a better translation.
Okay.
So much so that the name of the state of Florida, La Florida, comes from one of the novels, as does the governor, the German governor of California. What's his name? Arnold Schwarzenegger. He didn't invent California. The name California comes from one of those novels.
The one that predates Quixote.
Yeah. So Cervantes ostensibly starts Don Quixote, and when he started it, he doesn't seem to have had in mind a great long book in 2 parts, which is what he ended up with. He seems to have had in mind a much shorter work, which was just be a satire on the novels of chivalry. And so Don Quixote, whose real name is not Don Quixote at all, but Alonso Quijano. Alonso Quijano is a poor squire who lives in La Mancha, the flat part south of Madrid, which is not very interesting, and particularly was not very interesting in those days. And today it's a lot more interesting than it was in those days. And they have really good food down there, but and wine.
So make a mental note of that, everybody. Okay.
So Alonso Quijano gets his squire, who is Sancho Panza, and Sancho riding his burro, and Don Quixote riding his nag Rocinante. They set out to find adventures, and they go to an inn, and the man who runs the inn, the innkeeper, knights Don Quixote, and the whole thing is a satire on chivalry. And why does Don Quixote do this? Why does Alonso Quijano become Don Quixote? Because he is a novels of chivalry freak. He has them all. He has every one that was ever written in his library, and he's read them all, and it has ruined his brain.
Okay,
Later,
okay, okay.
later on, not very far later on, I think it's chapter 5 or 6, um, the priest of the town gets together with the, I think maybe it's the barber. It's been a while since I've read that part. And they go through all of these novels of chivalry, and they save half a dozen or a dozen of them, and they burn the rest of them in the first recorded book burning. Well, not the first recorded book burning. That was Alexandria, I guess. But with the same disastrous results as Hitler burning books and the Christians burning books at the Library of Alexandria. They burn up all these books. They do save a few of them. So there's a lot of literary criticism involved in this book as well.
Yes. Well, and this, what I'm hearing you say is I watched the Batman has now come out. We've had so many versions and so many narrated stories of Batman that we've had to come out with the Batman as the latest one in 22 with the definitive article in front of it. But when you think about this tradition, right, and it kind of gets at some of the topics we're going to next, the idea of the cowboy or of the Tarzan figure or
Right.
of the superhero, that you always, it's interesting, and I really am so grateful for this time with you, Dr. Josephs, to remember that everything old is new again. And it can be a hard sell to say, you know what, back in the 1500s there was this land called Spain where people were reading all these crazy books. We're reading all these crazy books about these kind of superhero guys, and you can read so many of them that you just lose your mind and think that you're going to become one of them. Right. Kind of like you could today say, boy, I hope a spider bites me so that I can become Spider-Man. We've seen the spoofs, right, where there's even a car commercial, Liberty Mutual, where the guy puts a spider and says, please bite me so that I can become like Spider-Man and sell more car insurance. And so it's
Go ahead.
It's an interesting connection to see that everything old is new again, and that while we're concerned that our phones are taking over our lives, people were concerned about it with Hal, right, as you talked about in the film, but also with this idea of chivalry and the hero and what it means as we wonder if violence is ever the answer to protect a woman, for example, with the Will Smith incident at the Academy Awards. All these issues are really not new. It kind of gets back to this idea that everything old is new again. And as I'm hearing you talk about this wonderful history and really a wonderful, fun to read novel for anyone who has ever dreamed, because maybe it's because I'm a woman who read it young in Western North Carolina, I still am drawn to those passages. But to realize and to hear an expert like you talk about it in 2022, it's not unlike our fascination with the superheroes, for example. You can do so much of that stuff that it kind of corrupts your brain and makes you forget the reality you're living in, much as you described with Don Quixote. So he goes off and goes in search of these great adventures. But Alan, that's not really what he finds, is it?
No, it's not. And of course, he wasn't just looking for great adventures. He was trying to, as he says, uncross eyes. He was trying to straighten out crooked things. He was trying to make everything right. And above all, he was trying to defend the honor of his lady, which is exactly what I suppose Will Smith thought he was doing. And
perhaps, okay. So defend the honor of his lady, and that's very chivalric, to use the English or the Anglo-Saxon.
It is
an idea.
It is. We don't know what we believe anymore, so we don't know whether he did the right thing or the wrong thing. One side of us says, "Oh, he's a hero. He's chivalrous. He defended his woman's honor." The only thing is, was there any honor there to begin with? That's
and can she not defend herself? And was it just a joke? And I think that's what you're saying. We don't know what we think anymore anyway, which is why I think that remembering that people have always come to have always struggled with these questions, I'm hoping can get away, help us get rid of some of the guilt of admitting, you know what? Don Quixote didn't always know what he thought either, and everybody still reads him. This idea that sometimes maybe it's the human condition, and that maybe sometimes it's the bravest thing of all to admit that you don't know what you think before we are off burning all the other chivalric books and chasing windmills, right?
Yeah.
That was talk about being a little summative.
Now, what Cervantes is really after is a satire of Spanish life. But he knew he couldn't get away with satirizing the nobility and satirizing the church and satirizing all the things that he satirizes unless he hid it within comedy. And so that's what he does with Don Quixote. And notice that there's a pair. There's Don Quixote and there's Sancho. There's the Lone Ranger and there's Tonto. There's,
yes.
And there's Robin, the pairs, and that wonderful series, the X-Files, he is Don Quixote and she is Sancho Panza, because Sancho is the voice of reason. Sancho says Don Quixote to Don Quixote, he says, no, sir, no, my lord, that's not a giant, it's a windmill. And Don Quixote says, no, it was a giant and some wizard has changed it into a windmill. And
yes.
And the army that he attacks is actually a herd of sheep.
Yes, one of the most heartbreaking for the romantics in the crowd. One of the most heartbreaking passages in the whole tome is that.
But
go ahead.
It gets very metaphysical and deep, particularly in the second part, when you get to the cave of Montesinos, where it takes on the whole notion of reality. What is reality and what is not? What's made up and what's not? What's just in our minds and what's really out there. And
wait a minute. You're trying to make the case to me, and of course I'm agreeing with you and being kind of tongue-in-cheek. You're trying to make the case to me that in the early 1600s, they were having the same what is reality and what is not issues that they were having in that Hal movie and that we're having with artificial intelligence now. Alan Josephs, you're pulling my leg.
No, more so. It's an absolutely brilliant shot at it. The Cave of Montesinos is perhaps the most interesting. Let me tell you what the most interesting notion is. 10 years elapsed between the publication of part 2 and part 1. In the meantime, part 1 has become a bestseller. It was translated into English in about a year, which is incredible for that time.
Yeah.
And the English read it, and the French read it, and the Germans read it, and the Spanish, everybody read it. And Cervantes promises at the end of part 1 that there'll be a part 2. But 10 years went by, or almost 10 years, and he hadn't written it. So then a guy comes in and writes part 2 for him and publishes it, but it's a false part 2. So Cervantes, spurred on by the false part 2, has to write his own part 2, and he does. And in his own part 2, the false part 2 exists. And people who see Don Quixote and Sancho out on the road know who they are because they've read the book.
Wow.
So you got metafiction. It's the invention of metafiction. Yeah.
Wow. Even before memes, Alan, you're sounding crazy.
I know. You gotta read it closely. Got to read the whole thing. Got to read part 2. It's brilliant.
But so this idea really of what you're telling me is that maybe we shouldn't be so flipped out about our technologies and all these things that are coming to get us. If they haven't gotten us since 1605, maybe they're not going to get us now, is what I'm hearing. Of course, maybe that may be what I want to hear, Alan. We don't know.
Well, I tend to think that young people today don't read enough. In fact, a lot of them don't read at all. And I think that's very bad. I think that's detrimental.
Is it detrimental more to them or to the culture, or is it a tie?
Well, it's both. One is individual and the other is collective.
So this idea of Don Quixote, and by the way, I couldn't agree with you more, but I will have to say that I love, as somebody whose first career was radio and who really loves the auditory and the renaissance of the podcast, I will tell you that we're all here because a young elementary school student named Grady said, why don't y'all make us a podcast? And I loved the idea that these children who have images and everything to look at and stimulate their eyes and their visual are drawn to the podcast, because it kind of returns us to radio and to those great stories where you weren't reading, but you were listening. And at least there is that element of imagination where people listening to us, Alan, they don't know that I'm sitting at a little table on the 19th floor in Myrtle Beach, and they don't know that you're sitting by the water in Pensacola unless we tell them. And then if they hadn't been there, they are near Pensacola. If they hadn't been there, they still can't imagine. And even though they might Google our pictures, they don't know what we had on and what we were doing. And so that idea that just hearing our voices and the renaissance of that with younger people, and the return to it, of course, with people our age, I think is really important. And so this idea, it's just y'all, listen, let me tell you, if this is the first time you've heard Alan, he's a way homer. You're going to hear all this stuff and maybe take notes, but you'll be getting it on the way home for days. Do you know that idea? Like, you'll hear Alan and he'll tell you something and there'll be a lot of stats and figures, but for days and days you'll be going, oh right, that's what he meant by that. So keep that in mind as I tell you, and we loop back a little bit, that on the same day, on the same shore, with the same tide, we're booting people out based on, we're having racial and ethnic discrimination and cleansing in Spain. And we're also having this journey to the New World where these priests who are on the boats with them are carrying the legends, and I think it's safe maybe at this point, Alan, to call them a legend, carrying the legend of Don Quixote forward to the New World. And then all these 400 and something years later, we see, really, because if you talk about, well, by the time we start publishing it and printing it and mass producing it around, but let's say that we go from 1500 to now, and let's say that we do look at 500 plus years, we see these stories literally get carried in by the sea, carried in by a religious person who was literate and read it. And then all this time later, we have the cowboy and Tarzan. Is it just me, or are there connections to this idea of Don Quixote and all the details you just shared with us?
No, there definitely are connections. There's no question about it. We like stories.
Well, we like stories.
Yeah.
And
that's why we go to movies. That's why we watch TV. That's why we binge on series. That's why we listen to podcasts. That's why we do all these things, because we like stories.
And so tell me, and for those of you who don't know, I mean, obviously, many of, if you're one of my students, you probably know him, for Dr. Josephs, for his expertise on Hemingway and modernism. Or if you've come to me in a more postmodern or modern lit class, you may know him for his work on Cormac McCarthy and his expertise in his writing there. But I think we've established enough, and if we haven't, then who cares anymore? But I think we've established enough that you know very much about these texts, or these myths. And I don't know what we want to call these people, Alan. I do want to acknowledge that for the most part, we're talking about men. Don Quixote, the cowboys, while there were some women, and there are some retellings of quixotic figures as women.
Well, I think you could call them archetypal heroes.
Okay, let's do that. Let's do that moving forward. So for today's conversation, we're talking about how the idea of Don Quixote comes into the popular Western imagination as a response and a satire to political oppression, and also as a response to this larger kind of hero tradition that is not unlike modern day superheroes. And that gets carried forward to the New World via priests, which is just interesting in itself. But so now that we've kind of established how that came to be, can you tell us a little bit about where we get Tarzan, because, you know, I got to be honest with you, as somebody who read one or two of those books and then watched the TV shows in the 70s and the 80s and the cartoons out there now, I think of him as somehow connected to the British people, but he has an American accent and he's blonde. And I'm just kind of looking at how he treats people. There's more to Tarzan, right? And it's
Yeah.
connected to Quixote, maybe. No?
Yeah.
Tell
Yeah.
me a little bit about that.
There's a lot more to Tarzan. The media, particularly films and then later television, did their best to destroy what Edgar Rice Burroughs had created. There are no good Tarzan movies, with the exception of the one movie, the title of which I don't remember, but it's got a Frenchman playing John Clayton, which is Tarzan's real name. He's an English lord named John Clayton. And he's born in Africa, and his parents are killed, and he's raised by the apes. Yes, and so he's Tarzan, but he's also John Clayton, the Lord John Clayton.
And that piece is important, isn't it? The fact that he is a lord.
He's very highborn, and he educates himself, and he speaks French, and he speaks German, and he speaks English. He speaks a number of languages, including some of the indigenous languages to Africa, and also some sort of sci-fi languages. He's a brilliant linguist, among other things, and an incredible physical specimen. Yeah, he definitely is one of the distant stepchildren of Don Quixote. He does not have a monkey that goes around with him. He does not have a son named Boy. Jane, his wife, eventually is an American, but he's not an American. He doesn't have an American accent, and he doesn't have blonde hair.
And so he ties into those traditions, and yet he gets morphed and changed really kind of to the needs and style of the time, doesn't he?
Yeah, in a way, you could say that Burroughs is he's writing about his own time in the same way that Cervantes is writing about his time in Don Quixote, but he's writing about it in such a way that you don't realize he's writing about it. But for example, in two of the novels, two of my favorites, Tarzan the Terrible and Tarzan the Untamed, he's in the trenches in East Africa in World War I fighting the Germans. Except when he goes in the trenches, he goes in with a lion.
Oh, wow. Boy, we could use that, right?
He sets a lion loose on the Germans inside their trench. And I mean, it's really good. He does. There are a lot of things that people will find objectionable. Today's very Puritan world will find Tarzan a kind of racist. He's not. They'll find him prejudiced against. They'll find him classist. He's not. He was raised by apes, great apes. The great apes don't exist, by the way. They're not gorillas, and they're not chimpanzees, and they're a race of apes that does not exist. And Burroughs needed to invent them so that Tarzan could be raised properly.
Oh, okay. So by today's standards, he may seem well, and just like it with Cervantes, by today's standards, what he tries to do for the love of a woman may be seen as toxic masculinity, the way that many have alleged Will Smith's action for his wife were. So again, there's a lot of ways to read things, which is why sometimes it might be so important to look at the history and the culture of the time, right?
Yeah.
So if we look at this history of Tarzan, which really comes in from a very British idea, and we look at the history of Don Quixote, we really have a very good look at two of the major colonizers of the New World, and certainly the two major colonizers of the United States of America. And that kind of leads to the idea of the cowboy that I'd like to close with today. When we've been talking about bullying, and that often there's a larger story behind the bully. As we see in these stories, they're not just talking about people being mean and taking back what's theirs. You know, with Cervantes, we see this idea of satire so that they don't kill him, speaking out against just shocking oppression. And in the idea of what was going on in World War I, well, many would argue that we're still coping with that terror today. And what this idea of a hero, again, Dr. Josephs, I'd say that when times are scary, we look for a way to salve ourselves or to salve ourselves and not be afraid to go to sleep at night. And again, these figures seem to be like a really great part of that tradition. The United States of America and the move west across those Great Plains, where as Dr. Gene Fuchs, another one of our great colleagues, said, if you've never spent a night alone on the plains and heard the wind blow, then you probably really don't understand the literature you're reading. It's really scary and makes you kind of question your place on the planet. Some of the experiences crossing out to the west, even by today's standards. And so the cowboy becomes a mythic figure who, or almost mythic figure, who kind of helps us, I would suggest to you, to cope with that fear and find bravery in it. But what I want you to talk about, because we've talked about England and Spain, is to talk about the cowboy's place in the New World, particularly maybe the United States and Mexico, and what that figure does when confronted with the bully.
That's a fairly tall order. Let's start with this. And I think it was his second voyage, Columbus brings horses and cattle to the New World. There were no horses, there was no cattle. There were buffalo, bisons, actually. And that's all. And the Plains Indians, Native Americans, the tribes at that time used to trap the buffalo by running them off cliffs with fire and stuff like that, but they didn't have horses to hunt them with. So the first thing that we have to bear in mind is that the horse and the bull are two Spanish archetypes. They're archetypal figures that will change the nature of both North and South America, particularly the southern part of South America and the sort of middle to northern part of North America, where there had been no horses except little tiny horses a long time ago, and no cattle, no domestic cattle or anything like domestic cattle. Only what we call buffalo, which are really bison. Okay, so
okay,
how did the Spaniards get there? How do they get there? Okay, so there's a wonderful novel by Cormac McCarthy called All the Pretty Horses, which is about a 16-year-old kid who sort of runs away from home. He hasn't really run away from home because his mother doesn't care and his father's died. So he leaves and he strikes out into Mexico with his sidekick, with his Sancho Panza, and decides he's going to go work for a Mexican rancher where they still do real ranching instead of in Texas where it's all being destroyed by oil wells. His mother wants to sell the family ranch to the oil companies to get the money to build a theater.
mm-hmm.
So she, in a sense, she robs him of his inheritance. So that's why he goes to Mexico. So he ends up on this incredible hacienda, which is actually a real hacienda. It actually existed. It was one of the few that escaped the Mexican Revolution. It's huge, it's enormous, it's extremely wealthy, and it's run by an hacendado, a rancher, and his sister, who are essentially Spanish and have been since the 1700s, and are proud of being Spanish and not being Mexican. And one day the hacendado, for whom John Grady Cole, our hero, goes to work, they're playing pool, and the hacendado tells him about Spain and about cattle. And he says to him that the only way that a man's wealth can, and he says a man's wealth, not a person's, not a woman's, the only way that a man's wealth can be measured is in how many head of cattle he has. And the only way to deal with those cattle is with the horse. Okay, now there's a moral in this. What's the moral? The moral is that all culture of horse and cattle that we have in this country comes from Spain via Mexico, all of it. everything. There is nothing of the cowboy that is not Mexican and Spanish.
Okay.
That's the first thing to remember. The cowboy is not an American invention. It's an American adaptation, but it's not an American invention. And it is Anglo-Saxonized. It is definitely Anglo-Saxonized. Billy the Kid is inconceivable in Mexico and very conceivable in the United States in the Wild West, because there is a kind of change, a morphing of the charro, which is the Mexican cowboy, into the American cowboy. But it all comes, all the terminology, everything. Calaboose comes from calabozo, and Mustang comes from mesteño. Every word that you have that's a peculiarly Western word comes from Spanish. All the notions do. All the knots do. The lariat does. The lasso is a lariat. The lariat's a lasso. A lasso means a bow or a knot. And so on. You can trace the whole thing to Mexico and to Spain. This is sort of the background that Cormac is using in this wonderful, wonderful novel, which I recommend very, very highly, especially for your first read at Cormac McCarthy, because it's approachable. Once you get past the first chapter, it's a love story, because John Grady Cole falls in love with the hacendado's daughter. Unthinkable, right? Because all of the Mexican Spanish nobility on the ranch, the father of the girl, the aunt of the girl herself, all speak better English than John Grady Cole does. So there's this whole class thing, because South Texas has no class pretensions, but this little hideaway in Mexico is absolutely traceable to the Spanish gentry of the 17th and 18th centuries. So they speak better English than he does. They've all been educated in Europe. They've all been educated in the ideas of Romanticism. They tend to be kind of firebrands, and this all ties in with the Mexican Revolution and the history of Mexico. And it gets a bit complicated, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but it's important to notice that the economic model around which all of this revolves is the horse and the bull, which is Spanish.
Well, and I think it's interesting, again, too, to say, well, now there's revolution in the background. I think what one of the major points we're getting at is that when you look at these idea of honor versus conformity, or how does a hero emerge? How do we get Batman or the Batman, or how do we get a great cowboy figure, or how do we get any of these great people that we try to model ourselves after, so that when we're afraid or we don't know how to handle a bully, these are our archetypes, whether it's Wonder Woman or Spider-Man or Don Quixote, right? The idea is that almost always, even if you look at the great Wonder Woman and you look at all the great superhero, there's almost always in the beginning of them some kind of connection to war or socio-political unrest or oppression or limiting of ideas. And once again, we see that here, where we come in and the idea of honor versus conformity takes place where some very old ideas, like you said, the idea that the American is this great guy helping these poor Mexican people just doesn't wash out in the world of the cowboy, where this young man has learned the English of the frontier, and he's living in a world where these people have studied formal English at its core. And so the idea of the cowboy not coming from some young person who arrives on a boat and makes his way in a wagon to California, I think may be a new idea for everybody. And so as we kind of wrap up, time that always flies too quickly, Dr. Josephs, I would just like to say to ask you a question. Don Quixote, the cowboys, Tarzan, is there any way to say that these are really an amalgamation of the old world? Because to me, it sounds like, maybe more to you, to go back to where we started, it's really more of how we live with and how we keep to tell our stories with that racial memory where you began, that same racial memory that made you feel at home in Spain because of your connection to your father. Can you maybe sum up the idea of the hero facing the bully and how it might connect to traditions over time for us?
That's a tall order. You've got a whole lot of stuff in there. I think Tarzan is perhaps in some ways not applicable
Okay.
because of the injection of Africa and the apes and the savagery of Tarzan. But the others, yeah, the others all, you could say, in the same way that the original heroes are the chivalric heroes or the epic heroes, which are very similar. Epic heroes of Europe, the chivalric heroes of Spanish literature give us Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, even if in satire. And Spain gives us so much that we don't recognize as part of the New World. There was a Spanish novelist named Ramon Sended who once said that there are two madmen in the Western world. The Englishman, we started out with this notion, I just didn't mention him. The Englishman with his praxis or his commerce, and the Spaniard with his spiritus or his spirit, his religious Catholic drive, if you will. The idea that they want to save the souls of all of these people rather than steal everything from them and obliterate them. That to me is the archetypal difference between the world of the North and the world of the South, which gets divided pretty much along the Rio Grande, our little trouble spot right now.
Yes, 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 yes. So go ahead.
No, I think we have to take that into account. Always, we have to keep that in mind and keep in mind what the Spaniards gave. Remember this, Pensacola, the town that I've been in for the last 53 years, is way older than anything that the Brits did. It was settled for the first time in 1569 by a guy named Don Tristan de Luna. And now they didn't last because they got hit, they got clobbered by a huge hurricane, and they had everything stored on their ships, and the hurricane wrecked their ships and sank them. So they had to leave. They couldn't. And then after that, you get San Agustin or St. Augustine, which claims to be the oldest, but it's not the oldest. It's only the oldest continuously settled, because Pensacola was abandoned and then resettled later. But the Spaniards have been here for a long time, a long, long time. And we tend to just sort of ignore them. But that's the fault of the Brits, because the Brits and the Spanish, see, Ramon Sended is right to put those two up, the Spaniard and the Englishman, as the two madmen of the two fanatics of the Western world. And England has done everything it can to obliterate Spanish history, to ignore it and to stomp it into the ground and to make light of it. And of course, this is again this is the Protestants versus the Catholics. That's the root of that, but it's not the only point of contention, shall we say. Remember that Philip II of Spain in the late 1500s marries Bloody Mary with the idea of getting the British and the Scots and everybody back into the Catholic Church, into the Roman Church. And of course, it was a disaster. It didn't work at all. The Spaniards hated the English hated the Spaniards. Spaniards looked down on the Brits and called them smelly and uncouth and uncivilized. And the British hated the Spaniards equally as haughty, overbearing, conceited, and so forth. It was a disaster. It didn't work at all. But it defines the great axis of the power struggle between the 1500s and the 1900s, up until, say, the Cuban War, the Spanish-American War in 1898. Particularly if we assume that American culture is an extension of British culture, which I think up until at least the 20th century is pretty much a given. It's pretty much a fact. Not so much anymore, but simply because we've rejected a lot of it and accepted other things and become more egalitarian. But that's the axis. That's the problem, and most everything else comes from there.
I'll tell you what, Dr. Josephs, it is really impossible to find a stopping point for all of the points that you have to make through a life you've devoted to scholarship and study. I, for one, am glad that you chased history instead of windmills. I, for one, am glad that you are humble and that you are willing to come together to help elementary school, young high school, and seniors have more ideas to think about. And I, for one, am happy to think that you and I'll ride down this trail again. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, Stone. And thank you all for listening. And I've had a windmill or two.
And maybe we'll find another one here again down the road.
Could be.
All right. Godspeed and thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye. I stopped it.
Yes, you want to hit yes.